we have the pleasure to introduce J.R. Ron, the CEO and co-founder of MindMed. How are you today, my friend?
Hey, Patrick. How's it going?
Good. Good. Another day in paradise here in sunny, beautiful Michigan. Sunny, beautiful Michigan, man. How are you?
I'm good. I'm also in, but I'm in sunny, beautiful Miami today. So.
Oh, come on. Rub it in. Rub it in. Sunny, beautiful Miami.
Right? I mean, the Northeast should be getting, or Michigan should be getting a little better in the weather soon. So.
We are. Should be in the 70s this week for the first time in a while. So we'll take what we can get. Okay, so I want to jump right in here, man, if that's all right with you. MNMD, your brand shiny new ticker on the Nasdaq, MNMD. Why don't we start there? How does it feel to be listed on the Nasdaq, man? How does it feel? Like you've been doing this for a while. I'd say you're one of the leading companies in the space. You're on the Nasdaq, a publicly traded psychedelics company. Tell us more what that feels like.
Well, we've been a publicly traded psychedelics company for a while, right? So we were the first publicly traded psychedelics company. But I think Nasdaq, obviously is where the big boys and girls play. And that was always where we wanted to be, because we're trying to build one of the leading companies in the space. And so as a platform, that's a great platform to be on, right? There's 2 listed psychedelics companies there now. Rumor is there's a third on the way. And I think that, that is going to be ultimately where the institutional investors are going to deploy their capital and where they're going to correspond with companies like ours. So, it took a while to get there. It was not an easy process, but we got it done. There was a lot of doubt that we were going to get it done, I think, from just, various commentators and folks. But I focused on that, and that was the objective. And, I think it's amazing because we really are the little engine that could, right? I mean, we have a really good mission and cause. And I think that is what motivated everyone working on MindMed to get us to Nasdaq. But now the real work really begins, right? I mean, the real drug development, hands down, building technology platforms. But we're set up for a great blast off on Nasdaq.
Well, let's backpedal for a second, and I want to come back to that sort of listing process and what that was like, because obviously, convincing investors that psychedelics is an asset class, I would imagine wasn't very simple at first, right? But it's definitely seems to be the norm these days, which is really cool to see. But let's back up. How did you start this company, and why? Why psychedelics? Why this industry for you?
Well, I'm an entrepreneur by background, right? So I was always involved in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. I was involved in Uber and went through the Y Combinator program with another company. And really, there's sort of 2 major, I would say, impetuses on why I started MindMed. The first was I was sitting in the midst of Silicon Valley. It was, things were going pretty well, but I was also watching all of my friends create self-driving car companies and autonomous factories that were going to put every single person in America and other countries out of a job. And to me, I was going, I think we're on the verge of a massive existential crisis as a human race here. If we can't, if people can't wake up and go to a job every morning and have worth to society, we're going to have some serious mental health problems, right? I think that was just sort of a trend I was starting to see. And people were talking about, some crazy ideas like universal basic income and other things out in Silicon Valley. And I was like, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue really ultimately is going to be, are we going to all stay sane throughout this whole process where AI and machine learning and all these, various things that my friends are working on, sort of come to fruition. And they're just starting to come to fruition. I mean, the next 10 years, the world is going to drastically change because of technology. We are really going to automate ourselves out of existence in many ways. And so it's important more than ever to have, infrastructure built for when that day comes or those days come to deal with mental health. Because I think, this can go two ways. It can either be an apocalypse or it can be a mental health revolution. And so the other major reason was I was struggling with mental health and addiction issues in the midst of Silicon Valley. Nothing was suggested. I used psychedelic assisted therapy. It worked. And I didn't understand why these weren't FDA approved medicines. It was just illogical to me. And so, as any entrepreneur does, we solve problems by starting companies. And so that's how MindMed was born.
So cool. And it's really interesting that kind of trend towards automation, and maybe in some ways AI, right, in the onset of that, led you to do this. And it's interesting too what you said about, the everyday person needing to feel value and contribute to society and go to work. And obviously we've all been impacted by that during the pandemic, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting to see that again, and we've talked about it. We've all seen the commercials for sort of those telehealth therapy platforms and the things that have been going during COVID here. But it's interesting to see how some of these things, these catalysts, are playing out before our eyes, right? Especially with this mental health revolution that you're talking about. So let's jump into that. Jason Silva kicked us off this morning. He talked a lot about psychedelics and the catalyst, or psychedelics being that catalyst for a mental health revolution. Where does MindMed sit in treating mental health, in shifting that paradigm, not only for psychedelics specifically, but again, advancing that revolution?
Well, you can talk about where we are right now and where we want to ultimately, I think, end up.
Perfect.
But right now, MindMed is discovering and developing new psychedelic molecules, existing psychedelic molecules, as medicines through the FDA pathway. That's the mission. Ultimately, we're going to need to create technologies that help scale those drug launches and ultimately help build infrastructure to deliver psychedelic medicines. But right now, our core focus is, how do we get some of these classic psychedelics like LSD into clinical trials, prove their safety and their efficacy? Classic psychedelics being psychedelics that are well known to society, right? LSD is around, magic mushrooms or psilocybin is around, and so MDMA is around. People sort of know and see it. It's been in been in millions of people, and that's what's super compelling and interesting. I think with starting with these classic psychedelics is they've been in millions of people. We know that by just putting them into one person's body, these are relatively safe substances compared to other illicit drugs and things out there. Now we need to prove that through the FDA standards. But that's super, super compelling. And what's also compelling is if you sort of, there's just so many people who have been helped by these substances, right? It's not like a novel molecule in pharma, which, got invented by, some, crazy mad scientists in a lab, and they don't really know what it's going to do. And so they put it into sort of a phase 1 study to sort of see how it reacts in the body. A lot of that is sort of removed from our process, right? Because we know, like, there's anecdotal evidence. Oh yeah, LSD looks like it works with anxiety, or psilocybin looks like it works with depression. So I think that's very beneficial as we think about our process and how we go about them in these sort of what we call discover, develop, and deploy. Right now we're in the discover and the develop mode of this. But yeah, like, we need to start thinking soon about how we are ultimately going to deploy psychedelics. And, I think Rick Doblin had a great comment in the New York Times. It was on the front page cover. He was featured there, and he was talking about mass mental health. And that is going to be really, really important as we move out of this pandemic. Mass mental health. I think it's a great term, and I think we should be using it more.
I like that. I like that a lot. So let's dive in more specifically to that process, right? And especially moving forward towards FDA approved treatments, right? You guys have over something around like 17 clinical trials that are either completed or ongoing right now. You're opting to branch out and work with multiple molecules, like you mentioned, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, DMT, I think, among others probably. So how important is it to you that you're not just focusing on a one molecule platform, right? How important is it to you that you're kind of treating let's call it a total addressable market of mental health, what do you think about that?
Well, ultimately that is the objective, right? We're not interested in making these into recreational products. Burning Man's great, but that's not our target market. Our target market are people that are ultimately suffering. And unfortunately, a lot of people are committing suicide at the moment. Like we're in a mental health crisis and we need to solve it. I ultimately think the company that has the most diverse pipeline and is developing that pipeline at an aggressive pace, ultimately has the most shots on goal, and that should be the strategy. There are some companies out there that are singular focused on one molecule, and that's fine too, and one trial or program. But our objective is we want to get these substances that we're working on through phase 2s, set them up well for phase 3s if the data compels us to do so, and then look at how do we partner these off with other companies, with larger balance sheets. And so I really think, ultimately that is the way to advance as large a pipeline as possible. And that's ultimately a great way to generate value. I think there's a lot of precedent for that in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, this isn't pharma, right? Like this is not pure pharma. We are definitely going through the FDA pathway, and we are, using a lot of the standards that are available in the pharma industry, and a lot of the folks that work for us came from that industry. We need them to get through the trials. But a lot of molecules we're working on, like LSD is assisted therapy. Like a lot of people neglect the last two words of that sentence, LSD assisted therapy. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind that, as much as this is about drugs, it's about people who are going to deliver these medicines. And we have to help build that infrastructure, and we have to partner with all the folks out there that ultimately, their life mission is to help heal people. There's therapists, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners. We want them to be our biggest fans so that they can help the patients.
Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that. So you alluded to it a second ago. Let's dive in a little bit further here about, I think you said something about the company with the most diversified pipeline is basically best set up, right, to potentially come out on top or at least to do well, let's say. So when we look at the psychedelic space, and especially for those folks watching today, and we want to boil it down most simply into what the catalyst might be, decisions that companies are making that could point to whether or not they're positioning themselves, as you put it, right, for sort of the best shots on goal. Let's rattle through some of this. IP for novel molecules versus generic. What do you think about that? I think you kind of touched on this earlier, but I'd love you to go further.
Look, I think classic psychedelics are going to open up the market, right? I keep coming back to this. It's psychedelic assisted therapy, right? So building the infrastructure in the first 5 years through a classic psychedelic, when you have that sort of marketing exclusivity for that molecule, could be really, really important. And then afterwards, maybe you're backfilling with some IP that, NCE molecule that has a better effect profile or whatever it may be. But ultimately, this market's getting opened by the classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA. Eventually, there might be some combination therapies of those. We're working on MDMA and LSD in a phase 1 trial to understand if that could be a better a better therapeutic than just a single molecule. So there's some really interesting things going on, but ultimately the classics are what we are going to see, I think, on the market first. And, there's been a lot of talk, and there's a lot of small listed companies working on these sort of psilocybin NCEs. When I say NCEs, which is new chemical entity, that's a long, long road. And if you look at like the pharmaceutical industry, taking something from discovery to approval is, can be 10 to 12 years.
Wow. So it's that much longer then. It's that much longer. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
So I think you got to have like an approach, which is a classic psychedelic that you're going to get to market. And you can have those things in your portfolio, but they cannot be like the only things in your portfolio. I think that's a really, really tough haul. And I'm not so sure that those companies will be able to sustain themselves with investment capital to be that patient over a 10 to 12 year period. Like, I think we have a few years here to make this industry work for investors and shareholders. And then people might start getting impatient. And so like, that wouldn't be my strategy. I wouldn't have just a total, novel psilocybin program that we were going to bring to market, because then, like my daughter would be grown up by the time we actually got it to market. I mean, the problems are here and now. We should be focusing on the, sort of the acute problems and not worrying as much about the IP defendability. There will be IP here, but it's I think, for companies like ourselves, it's most important just to get to market and then backfill later on. There's going to be incredible things that can be done with technology on personalized dosing and many things that will make these defendable notes for companies like ourselves. But my mission and the MindMed team mission is get these potential medicines to market as soon as possible.
Yeah. So then, does it then become what we saw? And I asked this question of Simeon a second ago from JLS Fund, but does it then become a race to the finish, like GW Pharma?
Just saying.
JLS was? Oh, how funny!
Yes.
How funny! Yeah, no wonder he talked about you. That's good. But let's think about that for a second. So is it a race to the finish in the same way it was for GW Pharma getting CBD approved and getting that sort of orphan drug designation? Does the company who gets it approved first win?
I think they might win for like the first 5 years on a certain molecule, right? For a specific indication. But ultimately, and this is what I keep coming back to, it's assisted therapy. You got to build infrastructure too. This, MindMed is as much a drug development company as it needs to be a technology company that builds platforms to help scale these medicines. Just by getting a drug approved you haven't won the battle in any way, shape, or form. So if your strategy is to put, clinics on Park Avenue and serve a very small subset of the population, you haven't won the battle at all. When I come back to that term that Rick Doblin talks about, mass mental health, we have a much bigger addressable market if we are going super wide with our strategy and getting these medicines into disenfranchised communities that really, really need them, right? That have been hit very hard by the opioid crisis, or have been hit exceptionally hard, in inner cities where there is no mental health infrastructure whatsoever. That is how I think ultimately you need to think about this industry, is how do you go as wide as possible? Do not focus on the fee-for-service model. Ultimately, we're going to have to find ways to get this reimbursed by insurance companies, and create novel mechanisms to do that. That is the opportunity, and that's what keeps me up at night.
That's interesting, and that answered my other question on the overall infrastructure. The telehealth platforms, the clinics, the overall treatment breakdown of services, let's say, that you're going to have to provide as a company alongside the actual, therapeutic itself. That it seems to me like you got to have all of it, right? You can't just have one piece of it, and I think that's what you're saying. So let's fast forward a second. And you're talking about treating those acute problems now, right? And getting in, and it not necessarily being a race to completion, but more so wanting to make an impact on people's lives and help them, right? So
yeah.
if it is a race to impact and change, and try to get things approved as quickly as possible because of that, does that also accelerate other parts of this industry? Like, are we going to see consolidation in this industry, and probably sooner than expected? Let's say if we're looking at cannabis or biotech or some of these other industries out there, does that consolidation come now, soon, or is it still a little ways away?
I think there's going to be a race to the top, right? I think there's a clear leadership pack forming on companies that are able to raise capital, have a clear portfolio strategy that's diverse and not, it ranges from the classics in late stage trials to, very early discovery programs, but you can't be betting on those discovery programs. Risky business.
Yeah.
Well, what I will say is I think there will be consolidation. I don't think it's in the next 6 to 12 months, quite frankly. I think there is going to be a flight of sort of the institutional capital to the top performers. This is one thing that Kevin O'Leary impressed on me from a very early moment in MindMed was, the institutions are ultimately going to flock to, the top, 2 or 3 players in the space that, make it to the top exchanges. And so that's what was so important for us to get to Nasdaq there, and be able to have those conversations and access that type of capital. So I think that is going to play a big part. But I don't necessarily see mass consolidation at the moment. I think some of these smaller companies that are sort of been popped up 6 months after or a couple months after we started listing, don't really necessarily have concrete strategies on how they're going to build a sustainable business. And so that's also can be very risky. And so we'll start to see whether they can continue to raise capital. And then maybe you will start to see, a company like MindMed or a Thai or Compass scooping up some of these smaller companies, but I think at different valuations than they necessarily are here now. We're going to be smart with how we allocate capital and how we make acquisitions, because I think it's important to, we have internally a fundamental strategy on how we know what we want to do. So it's, I think, important to stay there. There may be opportunities in the future, and we'll look at them. But I come back to, ultimately our job is to develop drugs and build platforms. As a medical industry, psychiatry, there's 38,000 psychiatrists in the United States. I don't know the number of nurse practitioners and therapists, but it's a finite amount of people. We spend less than 10% of healthcare spending in the United States. Healthcare spending is $3.5 trillion a year, which is 18% of GDP. If that is a massive market. That is one of the biggest markets I've ever seen as an entrepreneur. $3.5 trillion on healthcare. We spend less than 10% of that on mental health. We know that people treat their mental health as important as their physical health. This is a massive opportunity. There's going to be a lot of companies that become very big, I believe, in this space. However, to get there, it's not an easy path. The company that I think the companies that will ultimately win are the ones that are able to amalgamate and unite all of these independent psychiatrists and therapists, because they're not like typical healthcare. You're not going to be able to sell them a McDonald's franchise for mental health. They're not going to buy in. We've done our research. We've talked to them. They'll be willing to come on a platform, but you're not going to get them into a cookie cutter on Park Avenue in Omaha, Nebraska. It's not happening.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing to look at from an investment perspective is, how do you unite and build this infrastructure over the long haul that ultimately makes this a very, very big industry.
Well, thanks, JR. That brings us to time, man. But I really appreciate you being here. It's an exciting time for MindMed. I know Kevin O'Leary, who is speaking, I think tomorrow. He always talks about you guys being, some of the best returns in his portfolio. So it's definitely something that I'm looking at. I know a lot of these guys are looking at. The ticker again is MNMD. Where do folks reach you, JR, if they want to learn more?
Reach out to us on our website. There you go. And
MindMed.co.
Yeah. And for the Canadians out there, we also trade under MMED. I don't want to forget about that one. But we also have the Nasdaq too.
Awesome. Really appreciate you being on here, JR. Take care, man, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.